welcome back to the third and last big session focusing on media and communication. I am Ronja Dietschmann, working as a campaign communicator for Good Food, Good Farming. Good Food, Good Farming, as you have already heard in the previous session by my colleague Verena, is a broad network of national coalitions and civil society organizations, but also citizens, activists, and farmers, and many more across Europe, asking for a fairer common agriculture policy, both at EU and national level. In the next 10 minutes, I want to give you some practical examples from our campaigning. Together with the coalitions from France, Germany, Italy, Spain, and Poland, we have been writing a communication toolkit which functions as a practical guide to communication for good food, good farming. In my presentation, I want to flashlight some of these examples from the national coalition and also encourage you to don't hesitate to start your own campaign. Once you've defined your target audience and your goals, there's many ways to get creative in campaigning. And also, to be clear on this, communication is important, because if we don't find ways to channel the complex information in accessible formats to our target audiences, we might end up having a smaller outreach as we could have had. Therefore, get inspired by some of the examples from the Good Food, Good Farming network. The first example I want to mention is an example in which we were voicing our demands to decision makers. We did so by producing a citizens video to mobilize them to sign a petition and join a mailing action to MEPs. We were writing a pre-given script and asked citizens across Europe to record a one-sentence statement of themselves. In that way, we could cut these one-sentence statements in an easy way, just one after another, and had a broad spectrum of citizens across Europe voicing their demands. We included a call to action to sign a petition and to join a mailing action by hooking up with a petition platform. And in that way, we managed to get over 180,000 signatures and over 33,000 people that sent a mail to MEPs right before the October vote in the parliament. But it is also important to, there seemed to be a problem, I'm sorry. It is also important to find a good way of telling your story. And therefore, it is also important to find your hero. In this next example, we were producing farmers' videos which are already engaged in the change and growing a better future. This is a good way to highlight that we are fighting side by side with farmers, but also to highlight how the current system fails them. But I've heard many times as well that the CAP is a complex issue, and it is, but you don't have to understand every single complexity of the CAP to grasp some of the fundamental problems. In this example to the left, the Polish coalition was doing a very good infographic by linking the topic of the CAP to the topic of glyphosate, which is a topic that many citizens already know something about. And by linking this to a topic they already know something about, you can grasp their attention more easily than just talking about such a complex topic as the CAP. But also, being funny and provocative can be a cool way to grasp citizens' attention. In the right corner, you see a meme used by the German coalition with a picture of the German agriculture minister on it, Julia Klöckner. The German text says, "Climate crisis, but I have no car at all, highlighting that agriculture is still something that is often underestimated in their role in accelerating climate change and also largely ignored by politicians such as Julia Klöckner. Such actions where you target for example, in this case, Julia Klöckner directly, can be controversial. It was controversially discussed in Germany, but it was also effective because the agriculture minister reacted to this meme action targeting her directly. Next, I want to encourage you for your communication to build alliances. You are only one organization or one person or one social movement yourself, but if you build alliances, you increase your outreach by large. In the example to the left, it is an example from our Italian coalition, which created an internal monthly newsletter talking to their coalition regularly about updates on the CAP reform, posted some thematics insight, and always gave them a call for mobilization and participation in activities they could, for example, reshare on the social media or get active in themselves. On the right side, I included an example from Fridays for Future right before the vote in the European Parliament. They organized a tweet storm under the hashtag Vote This Cap Down by asking many civil society organizations and their networks, who then shared it in their networks again. We were a broad network and many people that took part in this Twitter storm. And in that way, we, or Fridays for Future, even managed to get the hashtag Vote This Cap Down as the #1 hashtag in several European countries. Lastly, and also in transition to the next presentation, I want to encourage you to work with the media and by, for example, organizing a workshop such as the Spanish coalition did, which were organizing a workshop to get journalists interested in the topic. You can both explain the complexity of the CAP to journalists, but also ask them about their needs, what they need to get more active on the topic. And the last example before it will come to an end is the recommendation to also hook up with personalities and influencers. The French network, for example, produced a video together with the famous French influencer who explained the CAP in a simple manner in less than 8 minutes. And this video had such a big outreach. It had over 860 views on Facebook, and thereby expanded their outreach by large. Lastly, I have nothing more to say really than get active on the CAP. Get active on the CAP, talk to your friends about it, and check out our Good Food, Good Farming network and find the toolkit there and get inspired by our examples. Thank you.
Speaker Hani Kohan a bit more time to talk about communication. Hani is an environmental communication expert at BirdLife and BirdLife's communication manager. She has spent half a decade working with the media to shed light on the CAP. So she's exactly the right person to talk to us today about how to communicate about the CAP and get the media's attention. Over to you, Hani.
Thank you so much, Meera. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Hani Kohan, and I'm the comms manager at BirdLife Europe and Central Asia. And as Meera said, I've been pitching stories about the CAP to the media for over half a decade. Last year, Greta Thunberg asked a question. She asked, in the midst of a climate and ecological emergency, the EU is about to lock nearly 400 billion euros into a new agricultural policy. completely ignoring climate and biodiversity. And no one even reports about it. Even a child knows this isn't how democracy is supposed to work. Well, oh, sorry, my connection just, just messed up. So maybe I can offer an answer to Greta Thunberg's question about why nobody's reporting about the cap. Because you see, pitching stories about the cap is a lot easier said than done. You need a lot of patience. Why? Because at first glance, the story of the cap is a story about budgets. It's a story about EU bureaucracy. Not only is it full of jargon and complex terminology, it's full of jargon and complex terminology that changes every 5 years. One journalist put it like this: it's depressing. Dave Keating, a well-known journalist here in Brussels, said, 7 years ago, I was really in the weeds covering cap reform for European Voice. It was one of the most depressing subjects I've ever covered. He also said, agricultural interests are very powerful in Europe and politicians are scared to cross them. And that's the thing. Sometimes talking about the cap can be dangerous. In 2019, the New York Times ran a series of 3 stories trying to uncover how cap money, in other words, public money, was actually being used. 2-time Pulitzer Prize winner Matt Apuzzo and his team spent closer to a year speaking to NGOs, farmers, governmental officials, scientists, anyone who they could get their hands on to understand what is actually going on with the cap. They quickly realized that this wasn't simply a story about farming. There was something much more sinister underneath, and there were people out there who didn't want the story about one of the largest subsidy programs in the world, accounting for around 40% of the EU's total budget, to come out. In the New York Times' own words, they showed how oligarchs, populist leaders, and their families had made millions of dollars from European farm subsidies, often based on dubious land deals or outright corruption. For those of you who missed it, the Times tracked down at least $42 million given in subsidies to companies owned by the Czech Prime Minister Andrej Babiš in 2018. These stories didn't go unnoticed. In fact, the European Commission even partially responded to the findings of the New York Times stories in a press conference when the stories blew up. But this was a very special case. You have a team of investigative journalists who got to focus on this one topic for nearly a year, who got paid to focus on one topic for a year. This is a far cry from our reality, where we're trying to reach journalists who have to cover multiple stories on a range of topics every day. Journalists whose inboxes are flooded with hundreds of press releases every week. And the New York Times stories are actually groundbreaking in many ways, not just because of what they revealed, but because they showed that there is an incredibly fascinating, juicy story that's waiting to be told. And journalists no longer need to go through piles of legislative documents to wrap their heads around the cap. They can just read these articles. And there is a valuable lesson to be learned here. And that is that even if you manage to speak to one journalist, even if you just convince one journalist to write about the cap, that can have massive effects. And that's what we saw with the New York Times, that a lot of other outlets like Bloomberg, like The Economist, who weren't writing about the cap before, have started writing about it now. The New York Times stories came out in 2019, which feels like light years ago. And many things have actually changed since 2019, which helped me and which will help you, hopefully, speak to journalists about the cap today. Firstly, the death of nature continues, to put it bluntly. Devastating report after devastating report comes out day after day telling us that nature is dying. And on top of that, people are starting to see with their own eyes that something isn't right. Politically speaking, we've seen an unprecedented green wave take over Europe. This is the first European Parliament that actually engages on the cap and is speaking out about it. The previous EU Parliament in place between 2014 and 2019 were still largely silent on the topic. Ursula von der Leyen, the president of the Commission, is the first commissioner ever to put the environment at the top of her agenda, to put out a European Green Deal. And thanks to groups like Fridays for Future, Youth for Climate, Extinction Rebellion, public awareness has gone through the roof on topics like this. You actually see people going out on the streets protesting against intensive agriculture now. You didn't see that 5 years ago. And we have the science. And by that, I don't mean that we know things today that we didn't know before, but I mean that the things that we've known for quite some time is finally becoming public knowledge. People know that our bees and our pollinators are being wiped out because of the use of harsh pesticides that intensive agriculture requires. More and more people are aware of the fact that space for birds and for nature is being destroyed on farms, that birds are starving to death because there are less and less insects for them to eat, that they're being pushed towards extinction because they have no trees or hedgerows to breed and nest in. A lot of people are aware of the fact that livestock is the world's largest user of land resources. Around 80% of all land on Earth is being used to produce feed for livestock. And people are learning that intensive agriculture releases cosmic amounts of ammonia, carbon dioxide, and fine particles in the air. Today, we have maps of nitrate pollution over Europe, which we didn't have a decade ago. We don't need to be scientists to understand what the science is saying, because we can see what's happening with our own eyes. And the baseline level of knowledge of the public and journalists on farming and the environment has never been as high as it is today. So what does all of this mean? It means that not only do we have a story that has to be told, we have a story that can be told. And what is the story of the CAP in one sentence? It's that EU public money is funding the annihilation of nature. That's it. The public and media take interest in a story when there's a controversy, when there's a scandal, when there's something at stake, when change is happening. And the story of the CAP has all of these elements in this one sentence. EU public money is funding the annihilation of nature. And before I leave you, I want to show you that when you really boil it all down, talking about the CAP doesn't have to be so difficult.
Tomorrow is the final vote on the CAP agreement, which will determine the EU's common agricultural policy for the next 7 years and counts for more than 30% of the EU's budget.
This law was presented under a commission that had no climate targets, but we are still going through with it.
If you're watching this video before 6 p.m. Friday 23rd of October 2020, it means the vote will happen in a few hours and we can still stop this.
But spoiler alert, we need your help.
This plan maintains massive subsidies for intensive and polluting agriculture, which concentrates the mean in the hand of a happy few.
The common agriculture policy is an EU budget supposedly for farmers, but the majority of the CAP has always gone to intensive agriculture.
As a farmer, if you have more hectares, you get more subsidies. Yet this encourages farmers to grow monocultures, to grow the same variety of plants on an immense surface, thus destroying the ecosystems that thrived there before.
Use pesticides and herbicides, which are literally killing our soils. Use tractors and machines that run on oil that we know will soon run out. And then to carry out intensive animal farming, which is mistreating animals by locking them up in very small spaces.
Today's CAP is once again putting profit before people and nature. The idea is to produce more and export more, while science is very clear that we do need to start toning this down.
Because we've done this for decades. And this is what happened. In 1 century, we lost 75% of the diversity of world cultures. And our waterways and soils are polluted for generations to come.
The CAP helps to make unfair competition to the local market in Africa, because we are succeeding in reselling our overproduction to the African market, subsidized by European aid, which makes them cheaper than the local production in African countries.
Soils and plants are sick. Farmers are poisoning themselves with their own pesticides. The people that feed us are
Oh, there seems to be an issue with the video.
Okay, well, I'll share the link to that afterwards.
Great,
so people
thank
can
you.
see the end.
Yeah, great, thank you. That was a great video. I had seen it before, but I'm sure I can watch it over and over. Our next speaker Oh, there goes the timer. Our next speaker is Lei Win, a food and climate journalist, used to work for Reuters. Thin is Rome-based, so based in Rome, and focuses mostly on food security and climate change. She has been covering these issues for more than 12 years for Reuters, and then also the nonprofit Reuters News, Thomas Reuters, the nonprofit arm of the news agency, and which also covers the humanitarian issues in Southeast Asia. And because, well, FAO is in Rome, I guess it makes sense to be based there. But she also runs a newsletter, the Thin Ink newsletter. So Thin, over to you.
Thanks very much, Meera. Let me just share my screen before I start. Can you all see that? Great. So yes, thanks to BirdLife International and Good Food, Good Farming for having me here. It's been actually very educational already. This whole day I've been listening to since this morning, because I am one of those journalists that Hani's been talking about that, has not been covering CAP at all. And this is, I'll tell you, one of the reasons I'm based in Rome is because I am specializing in food security, and the 3 UN agencies, not just the FAO, but the WFP and the IFAD, are also based in Rome. So for the last, I've been covering food and climate issues for nearly 13 years, but specializing purely on food and climate for the last 3.5, 4 years. And despite being based in Rome, I have not covered the issue on CAP once until that very disappointing vote that Harriet was talking about last October. And why is that? Well, Hani, I think, just laid it out some of the issues really well, and I think a lot of the speakers throughout the day has been talking about it. But also, I guess, just to give you a bit of a background, so I used to work for the Thomson Reuters Foundation, which is the non-profit arm of the Reuters news agency, and we have always covered climate issues way before a lot of the mainstream media started, and yet CAP was sort of off limits. Partly because, number one, we had a Brussels bureau that covered these issues, the EU Parliament issues, based in Brussels. So, we thought they knew it way more than we do. And also, we always saw it as a policy thing. And we had a specialist commodity reporter that focused on it because, let's face it, for a very long time, agriculture and farming and food was seen very purely from the commodities perspective. What is affecting the world's markets, the prices, not necessarily as public goods, not necessarily as an environmental issue. And like Kimberly said earlier this morning, it is super wonky. It is so technical and complex that we thought, some people who have been specializing in this issue for decades, covering the EU Parliament, should take care of it. But then suddenly, even before Greta Thunberg started the whole hashtag, vote this CAP down, I saw a press release came through from Slow Food International. That was on October 19th last year, saying this new CAP, this changes that they're discussing at the Parliament, that's actually going to have serious impact on the EU's ambition and this whole, announcement targets towards the Green New Deal. So that caught my eye, the link to the Green New Deal. So I went to my editors and say, hang on, maybe we should be covering this. I think this fits up. This is not just about commodities or a budget issue. And they're like, we're still not sure. So I was like, let me speak to a few people. So I spoke to IPES Food, for about an hour just to get my head around what it was going on. And then I approached Hani, who linked me up with Harriet. And, for the next few days, I just tried to speak to, and they also linked me up with some of the, MEPs, some of them are from the Greens, or just some people who were just concerned with some of the changes. And I also spoke to an economist from IFPRI who was a lot more circumspect about the changes as well as the criticism, because I wanted to have a bit of a balance in it as well. And in the end, what I discovered and how I pitched my story was, look, hang on a minute, what they are proposing and what they're doing, if it passes, it's going to have a big impact on this EU's net zero ambitions. And we've been covering, you know, anything that has to do with carbon neutrality and net zero, you know, from C40 cities, even before the EU announced their Green New Deal, Farm to Fork strategy and the net zero ambitions. And we're like, this is, you know, something we could cover. So in the end, this was the story that we published, which also went out on the Reuters wire. So it pretty much went everywhere. And, you know, again, I think like Ronja earlier said that, you know, talk about an issue or a topic that ordinary people are familiar with instead of perhaps the nuts and bolts of the CAP. So we linked it to EU net zero aim. And in the end, it was almost 1,000 words because we were trying to give as much context and background as possible. And I'm sure Hani would know it. It is so hard to get stories at that length out these days. If we're going to do a spot news stories, and my workplace at Reuters and Reuters Foundation is 400 words, maximum 500, which is so hard to do to give background and context. This one, we managed to do it 1,000 words. It really helped that by the time it went out, which was right after the vote, I'd already get the story ready, just waiting for the voting results to come in. Greta Thunberg was on it. So, you know, it was useful to really push for it. And I think, you know, that is probably going to be your biggest challenge, like Hani is saying, trying to sell CAP, but there's also a lot of opportunities to try and push the story, I think now and in the future. And also the video that I think Hani showed just now, it is no longer just an EU story. It is not just a regional story. It is an international story, because not just because of what the CAP actually does to the countries, you know, around the world, but also the fact that EU is trying to, you know, be this leader when it comes to environmental policies and agriculture policies. So what they do matters. What they do will be, you know, emulated by other countries. So it is a good way in, no longer, and, you know, like I said, no longer a regional but international story. One of the, I guess, what I want to say is just how perhaps, you know, if you may already know all of this, but look at when you're pitching CAP stories to journalists, think about some of these things, some of these opportunities. There is a lot of interest now on things around food and agriculture and climate change. Part of it is because there's a lot of high-level summits that are happening this year. There's the Food System Summit coming up in September as part of UNGA. There is the Convention on Biological Diversity that's going to come up later this year. There is the COP26 negotiations coming, you know, that's been postponed and coming up later this year. And then, you know, the debate about food security is also shifting. It's no longer just about famine and hunger in poor countries. It is about sustainable diets. It is about what agriculture and farming is due to our health, to the environment. So it's becoming a lot more holistic. People are looking at circular models. Take that opportunity, use that. There's also a lot more awareness, you know, partly because of COVID-19, right? A lot of the countries in Europe, even in places like Australia, US, they've seen supermarket with bare shelves, all the food supply chains, how fragile they are. So they're starting to understand the whole concept of localization and the whole idea that destruction of nature was one of the reasons why we are now seeing a rise in pandemics, and link that back to farming and agriculture. And I'm sure a lot of you are aware, 2 weeks ago, the Dasgupta review was published, the review on biodiversity. It was commissioned by the UK. And just yesterday, I was moderating a panel discussion. It's under Chatham House rules, so I can't quote, you know, I can't name names. It was a pretty high level discussion among, you know, including Partha Dasgupta himself and quite a lot of financial institutions, as well as governments, talking about ways to push some of the recommendations forward. And I know this is controversial. There are a lot of people who think you shouldn't put a price to nature. Having said that, this is already being pushed forward. Governments and financial institutions are already in on it. So find a way to use that to your advantage to see it. There are going to be real challenges. The whole issue with CAP, again, I cannot emphasize this enough, is super technical. It feels like you need specialist expertise. That's where you can help journalists become much more educated and understanding on CAP. Like, I've just learned so much more about CAP just today. It used to be the niche for commodity reporters. You need to go beyond that. You need to talk about the fact that it affects every single one of us. If we, if we're lucky, we get to eat 3 times a day. If we're lucky, we get to choose what we eat those 3 times a day. Everybody comes into contact with food systems every single day. They make a choice on what they want to eat, how they want to eat it every single day. Use that to your advantage. But be upfront about limitations in the sense of what you're asking for. Fine, if you want to, let's say, you want to keep natural land and not, have land convert to farmland. What are the trade-offs? What's going to be the other side? Because for both journalists in terms of what we write and for you as well, if you are a lot more upfront about the trade-offs, there's just so much more integrity and belief in what you are saying, that it is not just purely black and white or simplistic. I guess last point is just to build your relationships with journalists. Do your homework in terms of which media outlets you might want to pitch, and if you can let us know a week or so in advance of big votes or big meetings or reports that are coming out, that then gives us time to sort of become much more educated with the topic and do a much better job. Not a 400-word piece, but a 1,000-word piece. And if you can approach them individually, call them instead of just blasting out, email with 100 people. See if, it really can help if you have already built a relationship. And again, like Hani said, we are time starved and resource starved. So if you say, yeah, there are a couple of other experts that I can suggest that you can speak to that may be able to give you a different, lots of different opinions or support what I'm saying, that also really helps the journalists, because then that means, they can choose who they want to speak to, and they already have a selection of experts that they can speak to. That's it, I think, for me. Thanks, Meera. And again, just keep pitching stories to us. The worst that we can do is say no.
Thanks so much for that, thing. That was great. And I think it shows that having learned about the CAP and how it connects to everything, you seem, there's like an enthusiasm when you're speaking about it too, because you see that how it impacts everyone in their daily lives. Food is essential for us all. So with that, with those great 3 presentations, I would like to invite you to ask your questions in the chat box, in the Q&A chat for the specific speakers. Apologies. And before that, before we go to the questions that you've put in the Q&A, I'd like to ask some questions that were passed on to me earlier. So my first question is for Hani. Given that the CAP is, like we just heard from Thin as well, and you said that too, that it's a very technical issue and hard to grasp, what would you recommend for non-specialized media outlets interested in this? What would be your kind of few key main tips for formulating a good press release that could help, whether it's from the NGO's perspective, that they formulate a press release that helps kind of make some of these points in untechnical language? Or what do you think if you could give us a few tips?
Yeah, I think it's coming from the NGO perspective, I think it's very easy to get lost in all of the pillars of the CAP and go into the nitty-gritty and reach out to journalists talking about things that they have no idea about. And really, just to go back to the presentation, the story is in that one sentence, that public money is being used to kill nature. I think if you approach any journalist with that, they'll be like, that's interesting, Tin, you thought that was interesting. So the story is really there to be brave enough to leave the details for later and tell this umbrella story first and then go into the details so you don't scare off the journalists. That would be my number 1 tip.
Great, thank you so much. Anyone else want to add, Thin or Ronja? Would you want to add to that? No? Okay, so well, my next question is for Thin. What do you think is a good way to get journalists, like excited about things. So I think Hani alluded to that a little bit, that, you know, keep it top line, keep it simple, and make sure that it connects to some of the big questions, like budget is one of them. But how do you connect these climate, food, agriculture stories? Because you managed to weave it all together in this 1,000-word piece. But like you said, not everyone kind of makes those connections. So what do you need to be able to come to these stories?
Well, having, you know, I've been speaking to quite a lot of different news outlets in the last month or so, partly because, you know, I've left the foundation and have gone freelance. So just trying to get a sense of what news outlets are looking for. And the good news is that already there is so much interest in that nexus. You know, people are realizing that, you know, the way we produce and consume food is having a massive implication on our actually ability to continue living, right? Surviving, because people keep saying, well, we need to produce more food to feed people. But the fact is, if we no longer have nature, forget about it. Yeah, I mean, forget about producing food. We will all perish. So there is already that understanding among a lot of editors. So I think you know, in a way, you already have that interest. So it's much easier, I think, now to sort of approach, rather than compared to, let's say, even just 1 or 2 years ago. But again, I would still say, you know, do your homework. Just know who you know, that's also why I said do your homework. Like, for example, for, let's say, like Reuters, AP, AFP, you know, sort of news agency people, then, you know, see who focuses on what specialty. Their news agency, do you want to just do a spot news, or do you want to, you know, pitch an analysis piece or a feature piece that focus on the farmer instead of the policy? You know, just doing your own homework. Or if you want to approach Washington Post or the New York Times, who are the guys who specifically handles these topics? You know, so just doing that homework. And but then, of course, if you are talking about, just one last point, if you're talking about national, you know, reaching at the national level, not international level, then you really need to build those personal relationships. You know, I used to deal with a lot of local level lead, you know, journalists, and train them. They do like every single thing. Yeah, they're not specialists in anything. They do everything. So what you need to do is to really build that relationship, and essentially almost pretty much, you know, teaching them, holding their hand to bring them to understand the implications of it. But don't be disheartened, because I think, you know, a lot of journalists and editors are realizing that this is an issue they need to cover.
Thank you. And I guess a connection to that, there's a question specifically to you, Tin, about how the national, so at a national level, the discussions may be at a different place and compared to the discussions at the EU level. So how do you raise attention to things that may be coming up or are in the pipeline and not really have come to the national attention? How do you raise attention and I guess you mentioned a little bit that building that relationship with the local media, but if
yeah, and I think it also depends on the national level, as in which particular country, right? I was talking I think a couple of weeks ago at another event where they were talking about how it's really hard for some countries to talk about, you know, critical things about their own country, because the media, we've seen, yeah, even within the EU, there's been a lot of oppression. And then I suggest, then talk to regional partners. Yeah, get people outside of the country to write about the country, and then you can report what they are writing for the national media. So, you know, if you are already working with national media in a country where media censorship and whatever is really quite hard, you know, help work with a lot of the, you know, NGOs and environmental nonprofits. But like, you have a lot of partners, you can help local journalists in that sense. But in countries where there is quite a free media, I would just suggest keeping, you know, staying in touch with people. And, you know, somebody else mentioned, I saw, about personal stories. Try to find individuals, whether they are farmers or whether they're consumers, that can, with compelling stories. And I know it's a cliche, right? We keep saying, oh, you know, like, does one person really represent everyone? But personal stories are relevant because they speaks to lots of people. So if you can find people that you work with that could, represent what you are saying and what you're doing at a national level, use them as champions. Somebody talk about influencers, national influencers. That's a great way of trying to get national media involved.
Oh, thank you. And I like how you linked it to some regimes where actually journalists are being censored from talking about certain issues. So that's very, very important in certain countries, even within the EU, sadly. We got a lot of similar questions, and any one of you could answer this. It links a little bit to what we were just talking about, but how do you counter misinformation? There's so much misinformation that's being generated, not just by government, but also by those who have vested interest, and they're also spinning news in the media. And then there's social media proliferation of these kind of misinformation. So how do you deal with that? Anyone could answer.
I can go. Misinformation is a problem that you have in all sectors, and it's a problem that everyone faces. But the reality is, and this is maybe a lame answer, but we have the science, and that's that. At the end of the day, you can just keep saying what the science is saying. It's not an opinion that the cap is problematic, it's a fact. So, you just have to keep pushing that home and not indulging in the messages that trolls or misinformation is putting out there.
I guess just very briefly as well, I think you also need to, for example, perhaps lobby some of the big agencies, like for example, the FAO for many, many years have kept talking about how you need to increase food production by how many percentage to feed a growing population. And there's been a lot of people who said that that is not true, right? We already produce enough food to feed everyone. A lot of the problems with not having access to food are political. It's not a production problem. And I think, for example, some of that narrative needs to change. It's again, it's not about what we produce, but how we produce them, and making sure everybody has access to it. Then we're bringing in issues like rights and justice, as well. So, that also needs to change. And maybe some of the UN agencies, you might need to lobby for them to change some of the way they, the terminology and the way they push it. The second one, very briefly, I mean, misinformation, it is hard. It's I remember at one point a few years ago when we were doing climate change, anything to do with climate change is just so controversial. We'll always get pushback, but at some point we're just like, it's happening. It's happening. It affects people. It is accepted by, almost every single respected scientist that you can think of. There isn't a debate anymore. We're not going to pretend that this is something with two equally important sides when one side is just arguing in pure bad faith. So I think, at some point, farming and agriculture and all that will also reach that stage. Not yet. But I think people are already understanding. But I think what's really important is to make sure that we don't criminalize, individual farmers. They are having to deal with extremely difficult circumstances with the climate, with the changes in policy. And I think if we sort of, make them out to be villains when they should be on your side, then, that's going to be unfortunate, and that's going to just make that whole debate and fight so much longer than it's necessary.
Yeah, and thank you so much for highlighting the fact that it's not just about, like you've been saying, it's not just about commodities, but it's about just the basic concepts around some of these food systems where we're constantly told that there's not enough food, that we have to constantly be producing more and more yield, and so more efficiency and taking more resources from here and there. And in fact, it's more about how the food is being produced. And then it's also, I guess, the question around food waste, which comes into it, but that's a whole separate debate. Ronja, I wanted to ask if you had any comments or anything to add We also had concerns around how communicating about science and around science is so difficult. And I love the idea of communicating from a very personal story-led perspective. But just as activists, how do you contribute to this changing of narrative around food systems and around how agriculture policy is made and how food is a part of daily life, yet it's so removed. These kind of policies are so far removed from citizens. They have no influence over them. So how do you, of course, through media, it's one way, and I know activists use social media a lot too. So how do we bring these issues closer to people?
Yeah, I think this is actually a very interesting question, and I think one way is through broadening our alliances. Good Food, Good Farming, for example, is not just a network of activists. We try to like build strong alliances with farmers, beekeepers, shepherds, chiefs, and people in rural and city areas, and also and encourage people. For example, during the Good Food, Good Farming Action Days we organize every October, we organize a lot of decentral actions where we, for example, organize, or our partner organizations organize farm visits and cooking with unconventional food, or distributing food that would have been thrown away otherwise. And I think there are so many ways to raise awareness and so many actions one can take despite outside of social media. I know that the times right now require us to be especially active on social media outlets, but I think like building alliances and connecting people from different sectors will be key in bringing the message out.
Yeah, I love the idea of coalition building. One question, any of you are free to answer it, and it's something I personally think about a lot, because given that there is an abundance of food and resources, and because the problem is in the systems, sadly, even across Europe, we see and experience a lot of food poverty. Of course, there's a very high incidence of energy poverty, but there's also a lot of high incidence of food poverty. There are many reports that came out of the UK where they had done studies. And so, of course, our food systems, when are so complicated and not everyone has access, then people end up relying on food sources that maybe are not as healthy and end up relying on more products and foods that are processed. And so I was just wondering if any of you could comment on if you see a difference in the way communities across Europe are impacted by food policies and access to food. And so, like, creating a lot of these desert zones across Europe. And I asked that because coming from the climate movement and seeing how climate breakdown impacts already marginalized and excluded communities and impacts communities of color. So I'd be interested to hear from you. How do you think food policies impact those who are already marginalized and excluded? And how could the process itself be made more inclusive? So I love the idea of bringing farmers and activists and academics and researchers together, and even institutions, but how do you bring consumers who are left out of each survey or at the margins of society? How do you bring them into this?
That's a difficult question. I think I will try and answer it just from very narrow perspective of a journalist. That's the kind of thing that we are interested in covering. So if you have stories, please send, because we want to point out, the fact that there's all this people that are suffering from having, not having great access to food. And I think one of the really interesting things that's been happening just in the last couple of years. So every year, the UN agencies, the food agencies, I think, plus now the WHO and UNICEF, has been involved in coming up with the State of the World Food Insecurity Report that always comes out every year, annual report, right? And usually used to be just talking about hunger, how many people are undernourished. They've started talking about people who do not have access to healthy and nutritious food. And that is a massively, you know, like multiple times bigger than just the number that if you narrow it down to, you know, just the calories, you know, like how many kilocalories do you consume a day? So that is a one way of really pushing and getting those people, the policymakers at the big UN agencies to see these people that are being, you know, sort of like fallen through the cracks, right? To understand, I mean, I think the UN special rapporteurs on right to food and poverty have talked about it, but then it becomes really quite difficult because, like, you know, the UK was so angry, right? When some of the special rapporteurs pointed out that there is poverty, you know, food poverty. So it's governments don't like to hear that, but I think, you know, there is now really opportunity for organizations like yourself to really push. There is already, people are starting to make those linkages and see the importance of people, and then champion people who are trying to help. So last year I did a long piece looking at Black-owned urban farms in the US that are trying to fight what they call food apartheid in the US. You know, people love it. So, you know, find champions and tell journalists about these champions to cover it, just to get the issue out.
Thank you so much. Yeah, it's just because I come from the intersection of climate and anti-racism, and for me, it's important to see how all these interconnected systems of marginalization and oppression link with each other. But with that, I'd like to really, really thank all the panelists for their insights and for their tips that were shared, and all the ways that we can really boost talking to journalists and getting journalists, and even communicating just with the public, general public, on the CAP and on technical issues, to raise not just awareness, but also understanding of how this impacts their daily lives, and not just them, but for futures coming, so future generations coming. So thank you again, Tin, Hani, and Ronja for speaking. I know that there were